This past week saw three men related in various ways to a form of death, literal, figurative, and pending, and an issue that died too, at least in its current form, and all four of those offer an opportunity to consider them in a discerning way. Now, after I mention these, I'll turn to what I promised last week in a very important theological error that we, Christians and the church, have to win in the here and now. I'll start to trace the development of the fundamentalist evangelical divide and begin to look at that aberrant theology that led us to that win whatever it takes approach. The Reverend Jesse Jackson died this past week at the age of 84, or as Rush Limbaugh pronounced his name in the early days of his show, back when he was more lighthearted and funny, he would say, "The Reverend Jackson." And he was mimicking the mid-Atlantic accent of William Buckley, which some people who are born and raised in the U.S. somehow acquire and gives one a more aristocratic tone. As an aside, Robin Williams also impersonated Buckley as the genie in Aladdin when he was explaining the rules for the use of his powers, saying there are a few provisos. Well, just a few quick things about the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He was a reverend, but not a pastor. And I would encourage you to have your discernment cap on when you encounter a Christian religious leader who leads in a sort of at-large way, outside the local church, with a somewhat nebulous title like reverend. Now, when I do funerals, the director will inquire about my title, asking if it's reverend or pastor, and of course I say pastor. Pastor is a biblical term, meaning shepherd, whereas reverend is not a biblical term, and pastors are tied to flocks, that is, local churches. But you have all manner of religious leaders who are known as reverend, like the Reverend Billy Graham. Or the late R.C. Sproul, who, though I don't recall him using reverend, was still someone whose ministry, Ligonier, which he founded, was not tied to a local church for most of the time that he led it. Now, toward the end of his ministry, he did start a church in the Orlando area, of which he was the pastor. But Ligonier is just the name of the town in Pennsylvania where the ministry was based for decades before it moved to Sanford, Florida. And Sproul's video teaching was just him talking to some people in a room about whatever topic, not him preaching or teaching in a church. Unlike, say, John MacArthur, whose ministry was based at his church in California, and what we would hear on the radio were his sermons there. Now, having said that, Billy Graham and R.C. Sproul, and saying that about them, I'm also quick to add that I'm very, very grateful for their work in the gospel. We have people in our church who came to Christ through watching Billy Graham crusades on television, and I've recommended Sproul's books for years, and we have several in our church's resource center. So, discernment means seeing things for what they are, but it does not mean writing off everyone who's got an issue or two, as we all do. A little later, I'll remind you that I recommend dismissing people fairly quickly once they show us their character, as I said in last week's episode, once they show who they are. But that's not the same as dismissing everyone who has any kind of error in their thinking or approach. Not every error is a symptom of character. Now, Jesse Jackson is not in the same category as Graham or Sproul in terms of theology or morals. So most of my listeners are not only not followers of Jesse Jackson, but perhaps contemptuous toward his progressive politics, not to mention, as a reverend at the age of 57, fathering a child with a woman not his wife, a matter he was forced to admit just before the National Enquirer published about it. So all of that is true of Jackson and is part of his legacy, but so is the fact that he was a direct protege of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he was on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis when King was assassinated. Jackson is one of three men on that balcony in that famous photo pointing toward the direction that the bullet came. He saw what happened to King, and yet he spent his life seeking to carry on his work. And whatever you think of that work, it takes tremendous courage to do so. And I, for one, have admiration for those who know the risks and they pursue what they believe is right anyway, including runs for president in 1984 and 88. And in 88, at least, he put a real scare in the Democratic Party that he might get the nomination and then, they feared, be defeated in the general election. Or they feared that he might at least harm the eventual nominee, who turned out to be Michael Dukakis. But Jackson backed out to support Dukakis. It turned out Dukakis managed to harm his own chances during the campaign, and he was thoroughly trounced by George H.W. Bush, if memory serves, 40 states to 10. I'd suggest to you that disagreeing with someone does not require that we're blind to their good traits, even if those are few. Magnanimity toward opponents will insulate you, at least somewhat, from the charge of being a partisan hack and force you to take just a moment to think, to put yourself in their shoes and admire whatever you can. This past week, Jesse Jackson died, and former Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse is dying. Soon, probably in a few months, from late-stage pancreatic cancer. In yesterday's service at Community Bible, I showed a just over 1-minute clip of Sasse giving the gospel beautifully this past week. He managed the strength to do a round of interviews, one of which was with theologian Michael Horton, who's a gospel-believing Presbyterian, as is Sasse. And Horton's books we have in our resource center, and they did that interview on Horton's Sola Media. You see, Ben Sasse was not only a senator, but before being a senator, he was the program director for Horton's White Horse Inn, which I was introduced to in the 90s. That's before the internet, so I would order cassette tapes of Horton's program, mostly to my benefit, but of course there are differences between myself and my Presby brothers. But their commitment to the gospel is unquestioned, and if you want to listen to something profitable this week, then look up that 50-minute interview, as well as another one with Sasse that's over an hour with Peter Robinson of the Hudson Institute. Robinson's program, Uncommon Knowledge, is political and cultural. It's not religious, but it's quite excellent, and so I recommend it. A Claremonster named Jeremy Carl saw his nomination to be Assistant Secretary of State die, in all probability, in the Senate, which according to our Constitution has to confirm him. It's going to die because the senators looked up his tweets, even though he had deleted hundreds of them. As an aside, wisdom means never having to delete your tweet. But they were able to recover them, and regarding Jews, they said things like, quote, "The Jews love to see themselves as oppressed," and "Jews have often loved to play the victim rather than accept that they're participants in history." He says, Hitler is always the convenient kind of bad example. He goes on, "I'm very critical on the political stance and sociology of the Jewish community. It has been very destructive overall." He says, "You guys, the Jews, are spearheading a lot of bad causes." He says as well, "We need to criticize and critique them, referring to the Jews when they are enemies without being worried about being called anti-Semites." And in discussing the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews, almost half the population alive at that time, were slaughtered, an event that continues to be denied to this day, Jeremy Carl said, quote, "The Holocaust dominates so much of modern Jewish thinking even today." And he says, everyone has traumas in their past. How much are we going to relitigate them? Now, I find it troubling that someone in our present administration thought it was a good idea to nominate this guy to be a high official in our State Department. But I said he's a Claremonster, and you may recall from prior episodes that the Claremont Institute plays an outsized role in our government, one that's not always good. And speaking of dying, the Supreme Court killed the president's tariffs in a decision handed down on Friday. But the day after, President Trump imposed other tariffs in an effort to get around the court's objection. So what are tariffs? They are costs imposed by an importing country on goods coming in from an exporting country. So why does the court say the president can't levy tariffs? Well, they say that tariffs amount to taxes, and according to the Constitution, only Congress can impose taxes, not the president. Now, if that's true, that tariffs amount to taxes, then indeed what the president did violates the Constitution. But perhaps he will be able to find a way around it by using a different law to do it. Because you see, for the tariffs he imposed, he had used a law from 1977 that gives the president authority to do things he otherwise would not be allowed to do, but he can do these in an emergency. So President Trump declared an economic emergency, and he began using this law to impose the tariffs. The law he was using is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And it does not at all mention tariffs, but it does give the president somewhat sweeping powers in an emergency to protect the economy. So this comes down to a separation of powers issue, as our Constitution carefully prescribes those things that the executive branch, led by the president, can do, and those the legislative branch, the Congress, can do. And sometimes those conflict, as in this case, so the third branch of our government, the judicial, the courts, must decide as they did this week. Now, the president may look for another law that gives him temporary powers, but the one he had originally chosen, that IEEPA, was the most sweeping, whereas others restrict what he can do. So we'll just have to see. Now, here is what Trump-appointed Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch said about why it was that he voted to disallow the president's use of the IEEPA for tariffs. Here's what he said. For those who think it important for the nation to impose more tariffs, I understand that today's decision will be disappointing. All I can offer them is that most major decisions affecting the rights and responsibilities of the American people, including the duty to pay taxes and tariffs, are funneled through the legislative process for a reason. Yes, legislating can be hard and take time. And yes, it can be tempting to bypass Congress when some pressing problem arises. But the deliberative nature of the legislative process was the whole point of its design. Through that process, the nation can tap the combined wisdom of the people's elective representatives, not just that of one faction or man. Their deliberation tempers impulse, and compromise hammers disagreements into workable solutions. And because laws must earn such broad support to survive the legislative process, they tend to endure, allowing ordinary people to plan their lives in ways that they cannot when the rules shift from day to day. In all, the legislative process helps ensure each of us has a stake in the laws that govern us and in the nation's future. For some today, the weight of those virtues is apparent. For others, it may not seem so obvious. But if history is any guide, the tables will turn and the day will come when those disappointed by today's result will appreciate the legislative process for the bulwark of liberty that it is. Now, Gorsuch's opinion, as well as that of another Trump appointee, Amy Coney Barrett, and Bush II appointee, that's George W. Bush, Chief Justice John Roberts, brought on the usual chorus of tribalists who evaluate Supreme Court decisions not based on their merits, but on whether they are perceived to help or hurt the president. But fidelity to any president is not the job of the Supreme Court. It's fidelity to the Constitution. Now, their decision may be wrong, but if it is, it's not simply because it goes against what the president wants. Now, are tariffs a good thing for the economy? One of the features of discernment is to speak when you have some knowledge, when you have some level of expertise, and on this matter, I have none. My opinion on whether tariffs are good is no better than yours or anyone else's, and discernment requires that you know your pay grade and you stay within it. I have my own thoughts, but they are just that, my thoughts, and they are only slightly informed, in part because I long ago wrote off macroeconomists, as I found very few who can provide succinct explanations of their discipline and of particular issues. As a teacher, I've always believed that if you cannot break down a complex subject in theology so that it's understandable to your students, it's probably because you don't know it very well yourself. One clear exception that I recommend to you, though, and someone whose judgment I defer to on economic matters, partly because he's a solid Christian and also he's the son of the late and brilliant apologist Greg Bahnsen. Following David Bahnsen would be a worthy investment of your time. Now, of these 4 death-related stories, the 3 from our so-called side, Ben Sasse, Jeremy Carl, and President Trump's tariffs, each illustrate what I maintain is the error that has gotten us to where we are and whose history I'd like to begin to trace. Now, that error, again, is the idea that Christians and the church must win at all costs in the here and now. Ben Sasse rejected that, and he did so at great political cost when he voted to remove President Trump from office after he was impeached for his role in the January 6th riot on our Capitol. He knew it would cost him politically, but he thought it was the right thing to do. And indeed, it did cost him. Knowing that he would lose his bid for re-election, he did not run and instead became the president of the University of Florida. Claremontster Jeremy Carl's nomination and the willingness of supporters to stay with him despite the clearly disqualifying things he said is yet another example of no enemies to the right. That is, if someone is in my tribe, then they are right no matter what, and we must stand up for them. And the knee-jerk reaction of some to the Supreme Court's decision shows yet again that too often it's not about principle, about which, of course, people can disagree, but about whether my team won or lost. Now, in the next few episodes, I will attempt to make the case that in our interaction with others, in our interaction with culture, in our interaction with the world, Christians have been seduced into worldliness. Christians over a long period of time in our country have been seduced into worldliness. Now remember, worldliness is fallen values expressed in culture. And I'm going to suggest that we've imported those values into the church over a long while, such that we are willing to tolerate and even support things to which we should have a negative reaction, but they help us win. They help us win culturally and politically, and so we go with it. We want to be liked by the culture, which easily morphs into being liked by the world. I want to remind us of the scriptural assumption that the world is always alluring, and that is why it warns so often about it. Jesus said on the night before he was crucified, as he prayed to the Father for his first followers, he said, "They are in the world, but not of the world." The Apostle Paul told us in Romans 12 and verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. James says in chapter 1 and verse 27, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and then notice, keep oneself from being polluted by the world. In chapter 4, James says, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. And then in the first letter of the Apostle John, 1 John 2, verse 15, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. The pressures of the world can cause us to pull back. And they can also cause us to use methods that are man-centered, that appeal to the audience. The Apostle Paul felt that pressure apparently because he said in Acts chapter 20 and verse 20, he was giving his farewell address to the Ephesian elders after having spent 3 years with them in that city of Ephesus. He said, quote, I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you. And again in verse 27, he said, I have not hesitated to proclaim to you the whole will of God. Now notice the possibility of hesitating. Paul apparently felt the temptation to pull his punches, so to speak, but thankfully he did not. And that's what is behind the Apostle Paul's prayer request in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 4, where he said, pray that I may proclaim the mystery of Christ clearly as I should. In Ephesians 6:19, he words it this way, pray for me that whenever I speak, I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel. So Paul felt the temptation to succumb to fear and fail to preach all that should be preached, fail to preach clearly the gospel message. I'm going to suggest to you that American evangelical Christianity long ago began to choose effectiveness over faithfulness and decided that effectiveness is determined by what we do. And so our gospel appeal is found not in the message itself, but in the packaging of the message in an attractive way and a humanly compelling way, highlighting felt needs, moving the emotions, and making even heaven the draw. There was a song back in my teenage years by Dallas Holm called, the lyrics to which said, anybody here want to live forever? Say I do. Anybody here want to walk on golden streets? Say I do. And, you know, the problem with that is that who could say no to that? Who doesn't want to go to heaven? Who doesn't want to walk on golden streets? And so the content gets reduced to an easy believism, which is, at its heart, man-centered rather than God-centered, a gospel, or so-called gospel, about which Will Metzger speaks very, very helpful in his book, Tell the Truth. We have that book in our resource center. Now, a good place to start in order to trace how we got here is in the early part of the 19th century, the early part of the 1800s, a movement called the Second Great Awakening, and a central figure in that movement named Charles Finney. Finney was an evangelist, meaning, though he was later a pastor of a church, his decades of work in the Second Great Awakening was as an itinerant preacher who went from place to place holding revival meetings. Now, the First Great Awakening and the Second could not have been more different. The first was about 100 years earlier, and it was led by men like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, men who believed that God is sovereign in all things, including in the matter of salvation. And therefore, the means by which people are converted does not need to be embellished, but the gospel proclaimed and then depend on the sovereign move of the Spirit in the hearts of the hearers. The First Great Awakening had tremendous results. But those results were born of the ministry of the word, not the creativity of the preachers. The First Great Awakening is credited with preparing the way for the founding of our nation a few decades later. The friendship between George Whitefield and Benjamin Franklin, who printed Whitefield's sermons, heard him preach, gave money toward his orphanage, and spoke of him in the highest terms, is worth your time to study. It appears, though, that Franklin was never born again. But remember, for Whitefield, it was faithfulness over effectiveness. And that's to be contrasted with the Second Great Awakening and Charles Grandison Finney. Finney's theology was thoroughly man-centered, so that effectiveness was the key, and that effectiveness depended on the preacher. In fact, Finney developed what were called new measures to entice people to convert. His innovations included the altar call or the anxious bench and the manipulation of emotions to induce a response. So if you have ever sat in a service where there's an invitation to come to the front while the instruments play softly in the background, then you should know that that service and those methods are thanks to Charles Finney. Finney said this: "Revival is nothing more than the correct use of means." I'll say that again. Revival is nothing more than the correct use of means. By that, he is saying that if you do it right, it'll turn out right. That you can have a revival if you set up the means appropriately in order to induce the desired response. Well, I think you can see how the idea that it depends in whole or in part on our efforts to attract and motivate can easily result in using methods that are pleasing to the audience. To put it another way, using methods that are culturally appealing, which, if not very carefully evaluated, can be methods that are worldly. Things like appeal to the celebrity of the preacher, the appeal of the music, the appeal of the surroundings. I attended a training workshop a few years ago in Indiana. There was a young man in this workshop that I was in about discipleship, and he led a group, a young adult group. And one of the things he said in there was that the way he sets up his evening when the young adults are coming is he makes sure that the music and the mood are just right. And he was convinced that once they hear that music, they're going to be drawn in. If you've ever been to a seeker service in America, you've been to a church influenced by Finney and the Second Great Awakening. In the immediate aftermath of the Second Great Awakening, other forces pushed the church to compromise its doctrines, not just its methods. Views on the Bible and views on the origin of life and humanity, for example. And as a result, the temptation to worldliness became all the stronger. Many succumbed, but thanks be to God, some stood firm. In our next episode, we will see the beginning of that battle between what is called the fundamentalists and the modernists. If you have any questions or comments, you can send those to our email address, discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.